Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ceremony. Although my name is Bill Hammerman, when I put my top hat on, I become a Petaluman of yesteryears, William Howard Pepper. And I will also be joined by Marshall West, who takes on the persona of Isaac Wickersham. You just heard the mayor read the proclamation. The wording of that was also passed by the U.S. Congress in 1963, which was 51 years ago. However, what a lot of Petalumans don't realize is we celebrated here in Petaluma. That is, a group of volunteer citizens had their own bell ringing ceremony. That was 52 years ago. And my role this morning is to give you the background on this tradition that started here in Petaluma in 1962, using the bell that is behind me, mounted on the wooden frame that you will all have a chance to ring later in the ceremony. That bell was originally the Corbell bell, when we had it the Corbell Lumber Company north of town, and the bell was used in case of a disaster, an emergency, a fire, something like that. Well, when the Corbell Lumber Company closed, Mrs. Leo Corbell, the wife of the owner, was Miriam McNear Corbell. And the bell came in her possession, and then when the Corbell family moved out of town, they thought they should pass it on to somebody else in town. And that bell went to Mr. Putnam, who was well-known for his collection of historic memorabilia. He happened to also be the first president for the Petaluma Historical Society. Well, it turns out that his wife, Helen Putnam, a name that many of you remember because she was the first woman mayor of the city of Petaluma, and she was a school teacher at Two Rock at the time. But she had read in the newspaper that there were a couple of Connecticut Yankees who were lobbying to have the celebration of the 4th of July take place clear across the country at the same time. And of course, that's what our Congress did 1 year later. But what did Helen Putnam and her husband do at their house out at B and Fair Street? They had this Corbell bell that had been kind of sitting in their garage for a number of years, mounted on a wooden frame, was on their front lawn near an oak tree. They invited friends and neighbors, and particularly children, to come and take part in a flag raising ceremony, just like the Boy Scout troop did this morning. In addition, there was a youngster who tooted away on a horn or a trumpet a little bit. Then everyone is invited to step up and with the rope ring the bell. And then they proceeded back into their garden for some lemonade and cookies. And that's what we are reviving, or have revived ever since the museum came in possession of the museum, which was 1984. That's 30 years ago, when Helen Putnam died and the museum took over the bell. And this ceremony has continued on this spot for all that time. And you are taking part in this. And as you know, this celebration on the 4th of July is one of the most historic events in the history of our country. Now, Mr. Wickersham will follow me, and he will give you the background on the story behind the 4th of July. Mr. Wickersham.
Thank you, Mr. Pepper. A little history lesson. We all know the 4th of July is a national holiday. And for all you kids, you know it's a day where there's fireworks and goodies to eat. But I want to tell you exactly how the 4th of July began. It began in 1776. They were voting to declare their independence from the country of England. And in the second of that month, they declared it to be that. And on the 4th of July, they declared that they were finally independent of England. I have a letter here that was written, John Adams was George Washington's vice president. He was the first president. John was the second president, but in the early days, he wrote a letter to his wife Abigail, and he wrote, quote, "The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated on the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." So that's what we're celebrating today, is a ritual that began in 1776. Adams' prediction was off by 2 days. He wrote this on the 2nd, and the 4th actually became the actual day that we now celebrate. Historians have long disputed whether Congress actually signed it on the 4th of July. I think they signed it in the following month, one by one, because they were separate geographically. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin all later wrote that they had signed it on that day. Most historians have concluded that the Declaration was signed nearly a month after its adoption, on August the 2nd, 1776, and not exactly on the 4th of July, as is commonly believed. A little coincidence, John Adams died on the 4th of July, 1826, and in one of his last statements regarding Thomas Jefferson, he did not know that Jefferson died that very same day, 4th of July, 1826. It's been celebrated around the country in many states. It was only 1963 that the JFK had their proclamation about the ringing of the bell. So that's kind of the story of the 4th of July and why it happened on that day in history. And that concludes my presentation.
Some people wondered what happened to the 56 men who signed our Declaration of Independence. And in order that I get the facts correct, let me quote from a document that is online, because these are the men who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. 24 were lawyers or judges. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers or owners of large plantations. And then there were miscellaneous numbers of doctors, educators, and clergymen, all men of means and education. 5 of the signers were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons serving the revolution in the Revolution Army. Another had 2 of their sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the Revolutionary War. Half of these signers continued to serve their country after the war. Several served as presidents. Many served as members of Congress. They were governors of their state or their state legislators. And a number of them also played a role in drawing up the Constitution of the United States, which took place later. These men were among the original heroes that helped form this nation, now known as the United States of America. May we, as citizens, never forget what they accomplished over 238 years ago. All right, we're kind of way ahead of schedule, and of course we're supposed to not ring the bell till 11 o'clock, so let me check with Mr. Wickersham. How are we doing on time? Okay, we have a few more minutes, so let me fill in with a little bit more information. We want to make sure you get your money's worth by showing up today, besides coming here for lemonade and cookies. The story I told you about the tradition of the Corbell bell, the one that Helen Putnam was instrumental in using when she started the Petaluma tradition in 1962. This information is all on the museum's website. And for those that can get online, you simply go to petalumamuseum.org. But in addition to the story I told, there are also 2 photographs showing the young people who took part in that bell ringing. And they show one of the boys tooting away on the trumpet. That was, what was it, 30 years ago? And incidentally, Mr. Wickersham and I, we've had the privilege to take part in the celebration that has taken place on these steps. This will be our 16th ceremony of the 30 years that it has been held here. So in our memories, this is a most important holiday. Now, one thing I might want to add, I went online last night and I discovered that one reporter said there were so many people in our country who have never read the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure many of your children and grandchildren have done this because California history and the nation's history being a required course in elementary and high school. It isn't really that long. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all to you. It's over 1,000 words, and it is organized into 5 parts. There's a brief introduction. There is the preamble. And of course, the first sentence of that preamble is something which I think we all remember. It says, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Then the third part is a rather lengthy part that states why the colonists wanted to declare their independence from Great Britain. And they stated 27 different reasons to King George why they were taking this action. And then there was another part, part 4, that states the colonists' appeals of what took place. And then the closing sentence, the last part, is really the statement of declaration. And it goes on to say, "By the authority of the good people of these colonies, we solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." And then the final sentence is, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And as I told you before, most of them held to that pledge. So think about it and continue to celebrate the 4th of July by ringing the bell in future years. Mr. Wickersham, if you would please.
I had mentioned that the 13 colonies were separate geographically. The farthest north colony was New Hampshire, and the southernmost was in Georgia. They only met in Philadelphia in the Second Continental Congress. They were all of like mind. They wanted their independence from England, and they voted, like Mr. Pepper says, they came with a common decision to separate themselves from the country of England, and did so with their independence. I'd like to now ring the bell and mention each state in turn. There were many, many signers. I see 3 or 4 signers per state or per colony. I won't mention their names, but we're going to ring the bell for each of the colonies, and then we'll have all the children come forward after I finish, and they in turn can ring the bell also, and then proceed on through the museum. And we have cookies and lemonade on the garden court. So the first date I'd like to commemorate is the state of New Hampshire. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the final colony was Georgia. So kids, why don't you come forward, all you little guys come up, and you have a chance to ring the bell also, Boy Scouts included.
Right. I get your bike. Want to get this one?
Either with the hammer or you can pull the rope. You got to just line up here and I'll have it turn. Don't be shy. Okay, all you big kids can now come forward and ring the bell.
I'll ring the bell.
They're over here.
Good job. Oh, well, I got to get some good pictures there. I hope that bell's insured. Let me see where the bell cracks. How are we doing? Don't crack. I think I got it.
Oh, you are? Oh, okay. You got it. Glad you could make it. There he is. Either one.
We gotta come back and get lemonade.
Okay.
Thank you. Festive. Life is too short not to
You brought your own coffee. Lemonade and cookies. Hi, number 5. Yeah. How are you this morning? Good morning.
How are you? We have an effort. I know, I tried last second. Okay, what do I put And the second time, I know, right?
Everybody wants to read. Softly. It's a battle freedom, not a battle for liberation. Very good. Thank you. Those are nice. You gonna ring the bell? Yeah, good, good. Thank you for coming. You guys want to ring the bell? Yeah. Sure. Turn on the camera. Turn around the camera. Yeah. That was nice.
History Kids building, isn't there?
Yeah. Listen to me. They're cozy.
You'll learn what it's all about. That's for bringing the truth down.
Oh, it's our pleasure. It's great. We're continuing this tradition.
Thank you for doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. It is. I hope so. Good morning. Good morning. Who's the teenager?
Wow, you're looking great.
I guess you're going to be the last one?
Good morning. No, they're not the last. We get the radio.
Oh,
Okay, last call to ring the bell.
We have 60 more seconds, so I better ring it.
There, I'm with that man.
You're right. You're going to be the last one. Unless you get to it. That's fine. Okay, well, that's good.
well, hey.
You got 60 seconds. So go real slow. We'll end at 11. What's that?
Yeah, we timed it just right.
Not since dinner time if so many bells rung out.
That's right. That's right. It's making me hungry. Literally 30 seconds left.
We're going to hit it. We're going to hit it.
We're going to hit it at 11 exactly.
I'll hit it at 11.
Oh, you'll hit it.
Yeah, I haven't hit it yet.
You're not in
Here we
line.
go.
Ball's counting. You let me know.
There we go.
Paul.
Okay. Okay, I'll get the official internet time here.
We got satellite time.
Yep. Okay. 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock.
Yay! There you go. Good job.
Thank you, sir.
That's right. Go inside. We got that on camera, so that's okay.
PCA TV. We're here at the Petaluma Historical Museum with David Glass. What does the 4th of July mean to you?
Well, Miranda, it means freedom. It means the right to express yourself verbally rather than with war. When you look back on the history of this country, they stood, they fought for their independence and for their freedom. And I celebrate that freedom along with all of America. And here in Petaluma, we celebrate it with a ceremonial ringing of a bell that is struck at precisely 11 o'clock, which goes back to its historical significance when the Liberty Bell was struck.
4th of July is a great celebration, especially for Petaluma, because we've got the Corbell Bell that we mentioned during the ceremony, and that was in the hands of Helen Putnam, who was probably the greatest mayor we've ever had here. And now we've got the ceremony every year, been doing it for 30 years. So to me, it's a lot of fun to come down here, and the kids come, they get cookies, lemonade.
Nice.
Oh, it means a lot because I'm an immigrant. And so I immigrated on my own when I was 20 years old. And so this is the birthday of my new country.
I guess when the country got freedom was Declaration of Independence. When the country, I guess the people were freed.
Well, it means a lot. It mostly means that everyone has a good time celebrating the 4th of July.
Raise the colors. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.